All right, everybody, welcome back to Making the Argument. So we've got a lot of people concerned about, let's just say, the radicalization of certain groups, especially younger organizations. And we can call it wokeism. You can look at Antifa. You can look at a lot of these different groups. And you can see them appearing to gain a lot of power and prominence within popular culture, certainly within university campuses. And obviously, that's cause for concern. But what if I told you that regardless of the outcome, the right wins, the left wins, regardless, the woke lose, no matter what? We're going to actually be exploring this today, and we're going to look at this from the perspective of why would any organization, why would any philosophical movement or political movement want a group of people that seem dedicated to nothing but screaming at people at college campuses or burning down cities? Like, why would you want that? What's the practical reason for it? Then we're going to ask about how different organizations throughout time have used these groups. And then we're going to talk about how those various regimes, dictators, political organizations, what they did to those groups after they got what they wanted out of them. All of this and more coming up on this episode of Making the Argument, brought to you by Good Ranchers.
Quick intermission. As you might be able to tell, we have some exciting news for you. Everyone is back in the studio, including Mr. Nick Freitas. Everybody cheer. Thank you. Real quick, before we get into today's episode, if you haven't already, go to the link in the description and join our community chat because so many of our episodes are inspired by you. Let's get right into today's episode.
All right. I am your host, Nick Freitas, random guy in Virginia. With me, as always, my beautiful bride,
well, not
Tina.
Always. I'm not always in the studio.
That's true. Tina, queen of the bees.
Yes. Hello, everyone.
She's in it more often than you.
This is what happens when you cut off the introduction, babies. And then, of course, we have our resident historian and political prognosticator, not to mention mostly benevolent warlord in training, Christian Hines. Master Hines, how are you today, sir?
I am thrilled.
And then, of course, our producer of producers, Nicholas Hamilton, the good Hamilton, the one that doesn't like central banking. All right. We're going to go ahead and jump right into this. So the first thing that I want to do here is I kind of want to define our terms a bit, as we always try to do before we jump into the things that we promised you that we would talk about and hopefully solve by the end of the episode. So the first of all is what is this idea of woke? What is this idea of kind of like disruptor groups? So a very generous, and I think wholly inappropriate because it doesn't really explain everything, definition of woke has been this hyper awareness or hypersensitivity to social injustice, right? So it's this idea that you're obviously very, very concerned about bigotry and homophobia and sexism and racism and everything else, and you're hypersensitive to that, and so that's just what being woke is. In reality, what woke is not just simply hypersensitivity to these things, but essentially a worldview which explains pretty much every disparity within society based off of these sort of power structures which are rooted in racism, sexism, bigotry. And the way this is kind of gradually explained, and the way we see it more and more explained, is this idea of you either fall into the oppressor class or the oppressed class. And so the woke is not just hypersensitive to these power structures, right, and then breaks people down into one of two categories. They then offer solutions. And interestingly enough, those solutions usually include a great deal of centralization and control of government power in order to rectify these problems, as well as a broader cultural movement in order to kind of impose a kind of thought, police, right? Speech police, right? You can't think this, you can't say this. It's unconscious bias this, and if you say that, this equals violence, etc. So when you look at what woke really encapsulates, it's far more than just a hypersensitivity to racism or anything like that. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to kind of look at how this has been utilized in the past, because this is not a new phenomenon, right? And we're also going to take a look at how does the sort of disruption that you see within these like ultra woke groups manifest itself in violence, right? We see Antifa and we see the way that Antifa behaves. And then even when Antifa has chapters set up and it has meetings and people show up and they start, they have their own little flag and whatnot, you still have people like Joe Biden saying Antifa is not an organization, it's just a concept. No, it's an organization. And it's not, spoiler alert, it's not just simply organized around being anti-fascist. That may be a very, very nice marketing scheme. That's certainly a nice way to put it out there to the general population, because who wants to be fascist, right? Hopefully nobody. But it's amazing how organizations like Antifa certainly use a lot of tactics that historically we would have associated with fascism or communism when it comes to trying to achieve their end states, right? So we're going to explain kind of the history of some of this. And like I said, we're also going to go into why is it necessary? Why do certain political ideologies find these sorts of organizations, these sorts of groups so useful? Or why do they attempt to set up groups like this in order to achieve their political purposes? All right. So before we get into why is it useful, I want to talk about something that's incredibly useful, and that is Good Ranchers, right? Because if you are hungry, right, and you get hangry, chances are you could fall victim to one of these organizations trying to violently overthrow the United States government, and you don't want that. And so the way you're going to prevent that is you're going to go to goodranchers.com, you're going to use promo code Nick, and you're going to sign up for one of their subscriptions in order to get the best beef, pork, poultry, wild-caught seafood in the country. Not to mention that you're going to get these things without any of these, mRNA vaccines that they're now throwing at your livestock, right? Not to mention the fact that you're also going to get American-raised meat. Because when you go into the grocery store and you see a little, product of the USA, remember, that doesn't mean it was raised here by an American farmer and rancher that, brought this up and gave you the quality that you wanted. It could have been raised in a feedlot somewhere else, brought to the United States, gone through a minor set of processing, and now all of a sudden it's a product of the United States. When you go to goodranchers.com, use promo code Nick, you're getting the sort of product that they promise you that you're getting with no strings attached. Not to mention the fact that if you sign up for the subscription here in the month, the subscription in the month of March, you are also going to get a free Easter ham with your order. I mean, come on, that's hard to beat. Not to mention the other various things that you can go on to the goodranchers.com website. They've got some great swag in it. They've actually got some hysterical swag. We've worn some of it on the show and some of our reels, and we'll probably do some more of that later. So goodranchers.com, promo code Nick, go in and check it out. All right. So the first thing that we're going to jump into here is, why are these organizations useful? And I think the first thing that we have to discuss is kind of like, what is the objective? Because when you see, like we've all seen the clips from when, Matt Walsh or Ben Shapiro, Dinesh D'Souza go to one of these university campuses.
Jordan Peterson as well,
right? When they go to one of these university campuses and they talk about things, you will have these students that stand up and just start screaming. It's not that they're like, well, Dr. Peterson, that's an interesting point, but counterpoint. No, they start screaming at them. Like I had to call down to VCU campus because when Kristen Hawkins came down here and she works with Students for Life, they were there and they were just talking about what they believe and why they believed it. They were threatened. They were intimidated. And when I called up VCU to say, what the heck is going on a Virginia campus, when somebody shows up to speak about this and they say, oh, no, we handled it within protocol. It's fine. I'm like, oh, so you removed the disruptive people and they got a chance to speak. Well, no, we shut down the event. Okay, that's probably not the way to handle this because we're encouraging this sort of activity to where if you show up and you threaten and you intimidate and you scream and you yell, you get what you want. And chances are that's not the sort of dialogue we want to foster on a college campus. Now, to VCU's credit, they invited her back, got her the proper security, and she was able to go ahead and do her event. But when we ask, what's the objective for this disruption? Well, increasingly what we see are these groups that are able to, if they can't just get a speaker outright canceled in the first place, and they have a number of ways of doing this, whether it's making threats or the university say, well, if you come and speak, it's going to require all this additional security and you have to pay for it, right? So what's the objective? It's to shut down debate. It's not to foster debate. It's to shut it down. And so these groups start to get away with it, and it's no surprise that this happens within college campuses, but we're also starting to see it happening outside of the campus now. When Antifa shows up and they're attempting to intimidate people, or they beat somebody up in Portland for daring to have a sign that they don't like, when Billboard Chris is getting threatened by people that think that it's perfectly okay to hit him, push him, and intimidate him because he's saying things we don't like, and that's violence. Right? When organizations can riot through the streets, not peacefully protest, riot through the streets, loot stores, and politicians get up there and say, well, this is just about them sharing their pain and their suffering in order to make sure that you finally understand what they're going for, and then offer to bail them out of jail. Vice President Kamala Harris did this.
I was about to say it's more than just Antifa.
Oh, no, yeah, it's not.
BLM. I remember the summer of 2020. Here's a more recent example. It's all of the pro-Palestinian / pro-Hamas protesters.
Yeah.
Right? That took to the streets, that, shouted all sorts of things like, openly like genocidal rhetoric. Right? And, more recently in Virginia, I-95 through Richmond was shut down by those people today, the day that we're recording this episode. So like, that's another example of something where it's not violent, but it's disruptive in the sense that the left loves to block highways and roads.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
They love to take over college campuses. They love to protest in front of, storefronts if they're not burning them down. And within companies, within like Wall Street and Silicon Valley and corporate America, you see the exact same thing where it's like the middle management of these companies. It's usually not actually the CEO that decides, I'm going to turn the company into a factory for woke propaganda. It's usually like the middle management within the companies that will say things like, well, we demand more equity, or we demand, whatever the ideological goal is. Like you saw this with Netflix a few years ago where they were demanding more diverse characters or whatever, when in reality what they wanted was to take old IPs and completely rework them or whitewash them in order to push an ideological agenda. And so again, it's more than just Antifa. They're kind of the most prominent because they cracking heads.
You see the same thing with Just Stop Oil, right? When Just Stop Oil gets out there and they're very prominent in the UK, where they'll shut down roads, they'll go into the Louvre and they'll try to destroy famous works of art, they'll try to destroy monuments and things of that nature. And the question is okay, what is the objective? Because a lot of people will look at that and say, okay, well they're losing followers by doing this, or they're hurting their message by doing this. Are they? Because when I look at university campuses and you can't get the head of Harvard to say, yeah, we don't, advocating genocide against certain people is against our policy, right? Like again, if they had said advocating genocide against trans people, she would have had no problem answering that question. It's absolutely against our policy. We don't tolerate that sort of hate speech within our campus. But as soon as it was Jews, it was like, well, now we got to equivocate about what's allowed and what's not allowed. And I think what I want people to understand is, why would any organization want to use groups like this in order to achieve their objectives? Because they're probably thinking in their mind, well, this is just far-flung, radical group. No. Mainstream organizations and institutions manipulate and use organizations like this in order to get their point across, because they keep enough separation from them to where they can then come in and look like the more reasonable people, or they can utilize them to do things that they personally don't want to be stained with. And so when they cause problems by blocking traffic or burning down stores or looting or destroying art or things like that, you'll always see the left come in and they don't condemn it, right? If anything, they might say, well, they're just very passionate about what they believe. They're just, if only they tried to talk to us peacefully and we didn't listen. And so now they've been forced to resort to these sorts of measures.
We need to address the root cause that is leading to these protests and activism and stuff like that. Because all of them have a stated ideological goal, right? You brought up Just Stop Oil, for example. Like, they're obsessed with things like net zero in Europe. In the United States, they call it other things, right? But it's the entire climate change narrative, right? In the U.S. it would be like, we want the Green New Deal.
Yeah.
And the point there is that when left-wing politicians get up and they're asked about these things, like you said, they don't condemn the movement. Instead, they say, well, we need to address, whatever the cause that they throw out there is leading to these people to push this thing. As if this is some sort of organic, spontaneous thing where these people actually have a cause. It again reminds me of the meme that I told you about in a few podcasts ago. I can't remember which one, where it was like, climate change is going to destroy us. We need to uproot our socioeconomic system. And then the guy in the next panel is like, well, how about nuclear? And then the third panel, he's lighting the folder on fire, the first guy. And he's like, no, I don't want nuclear. I want to destroy our socioeconomic system.
Well, it's why, like with the green movement, they used to talk about, it was the watermelon movement, right? It was green on the outside and red in the middle. And so the question is, if that's the objective, if the usefulness of these organizations is that it provides a foil, right? It provides a way to be able to go out there and kind of cause disruption and keep the focus on the topics that the left wants to focus on, or whoever is activating these groups wants to focus on. Then the question is okay, why are these, like, how do you get people to join these groups? Why are they valuable? Because it is not, I think we should say that in a civilized society, it is not normal that when you get mad about something, you set a city on fire and loot the local Reebok store, right? Like that's not what we consider normal. When if you're upset about climate change, going out and shutting down I-95, not normal, right? Not this, trying to throw tomato soup on the Mona Lisa, right? These are not normal. So what sort of people do this? And what's fascinating is when you trace this back to the whole idea of, again, wokeism, and we're going to divide the world into oppressor and oppressed, understand that when that radicalized student starts screaming in the middle of an Indian immigrant, Dinesh D'Souza, right, giving a speech, calling him a fascist, without having any clue about what fascist ideology actually includes, right? That's the point. They don't want someone to show up and get in an intelligent debate with Dinesh D'Souza because they'll probably get crushed.
So they're just useful idiots, basically.
Well, but it's not just, there's a lot of idiots that aren't useful.
Okay.
What makes someone a useful idiot is an important question.
Yes, because that's actually brilliant, the way that you just portrayed that there's a lot of idiots out there that aren't useful.
Yeah.
Because like go on Twitter or Reddit and you'll know exactly what Nick's talking about right there. Because there's plenty of people on the left that will complain about things like in online spaces, but that's not nearly as effective to getting what they want as the people that are actually going out there in public doing stuff. Like, you better believe that there's a big division right now within the Democratic Party because of all of the Palestinian protests. That's a lot bigger of an issue than somebody on Reddit complaining about whatever it is that they're complaining about. So, like, I think the question that, if you're listening to this podcast and you're on the right, and as I've said many times, you probably are, although not guaranteed. Yeah. There are some people in the center and even on the left that listen to us. But if you're listening to this podcast and you're trying to understand, why do so many different groups that seemingly have nothing in common with each other are all pushing what is effectively cultural Marxism, but through different angles? And what is their end goal? And then going back to the original premise that you said in this podcast about how wokeism is going to lose no matter what happens. Mm-hmm. I think that whole question of what makes a useful idiot useful is actually a really ingenious way to kind of look at this.
Well, and I think, so as I've been kind of looking at this from an historical perspective, but also just like logically, like if you wanted to activate large groups of people in order to do the things that you wanted, right? Get certain things done or push certain narratives or whatever it is. Who would you typically go for? Well, you probably want to go for the elderly, right? You probably want to go for the elderly because they don't have the physical capacity to do the things that you want them to do. Plus, they've probably got a fairly good footing on what they think about the world.
They've lived enough life to know better.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. They've lived enough life a little bit. So you probably want to go younger. You also probably don't want to go with people that you can either have been marginalized or that you can make to feel that they have been marginalized.
Or that you can make feel like they owe somebody for like systematic marginalization. Basically.
You're not going to go for successful or productive people that have made something out of themselves or make a living or have accumulated a lot of wealth.
You're going to go
You're not
for
going to get
people
the business owner or the small business owner or the retired person, independently wealthy person that, invented something. Like,
no, because they have stuff to do.
Not only do they have something to lose by overthrowing our socioeconomic system, to quote the meme again, but those people tend to, the productive members of society that either have become productive because they're genuinely like geniuses that have done something, or they've put in the time and effort, right? Either they're an inventor or they're just a hard worker or they're a businessman, whatever it is. You're not going to get those people on board, not just because they have something to lose by overthrowing the system, but that's what the Marxists would say. That's what somebody like Gramsci would say, right? But also because you can't necessarily control those people. They have a mind of their own.
If they're productive, if they're problem solvers, if they're critical thinkers, right? That's actually problematic. And let me caveat this. This goes for a left-wing organization wanting to manipulate, or a right-wing organization that wanted to do it, right? Or an organization that might be historically associated with the right. I want to make this very, very clear because I want to be intellectually honest across the board. When you're looking for a useful idiot, there's a model there. And part of that usefulness is if they're younger, they probably haven't lived as much life and they've got a lot of lifespan ahead of them. Plus, physically, they're probably in a condition where they might be more willing to show up, activate. They're not as aware of the consequences of their actions, right? Or the long-term consequences of their actions. The other thing is that they haven't lived a lot of life. They're probably a little bit easier to manipulate or to feed a particular narrative about society, especially if they feel isolated, if they don't quite fit in, if they haven't been, successful, if the efforts that they have put towards stuff hasn't yielded the fruit that they want, right? And you come in and you blame everybody else instead of saying, well, maybe you need to do it differently or maybe you need to work differently. This all feeds into, an ego. It all feeds into an apparent narrative. And look, no less a person. He wasn't radicalized, but look at Thomas Sowell. Thomas Sowell, when he was lost his parents when he was very young, grew up in New York City, was, I think, a bike messenger for a while, did some other work over there. And he used to talk about how he thought Marxism explained the world very well based off of what he was seeing and because he hadn't really been exposed to alternative theories on it, right? There was just kind of the way things were. That was one argument. And then Karl Marx comes along and says, well, no, young Thomas Sowell, the reason why you don't have a lot and the reason why those people on Fifth Avenue do is because they're exploiting your labor. Well, if you don't really have an alternative theory that makes sense to you, and you haven't lived enough life to realize that, okay, this doesn't work out the way you're promising, that can seem to make a lot of sense.
Especially if every single institution has been captured by whatever side is trying to do the, I guess, radicalization.
Oh, then it becomes easy.
One of the reasons I think right now, typically we associate this type of thing with the left because they do it the most. One of the reasons why I think they do it the most is because ideologically, the left has captured all of those institutions, which have raised them up through the ranks to become what they are. And it's a great strategy if you're trying to take over.
Well, and I think and again, when we get back to the whole usefulness question, so you want someone that you can essentially manipulate, right? You can offer your worldview or the objectives of the ideology or whatnot as the explanation for what is wrong and the pathway to improve it. Right, the pathway to make it better. The other thing that you need to be, if you're going to be a useful, idiot, is you have to be able to activate them, right? Because it's one thing if they believe it, but all they do is sit in their mom's basement. Now, I will say this: sitting in your mom's basement has actually become, that used to be a huge drawback, right? That had no real usefulness to anybody that wanted to achieve their objectives. Now, with the power of social media and other things like that, you still might be able to go out there and push out a larger narrative on social media that still has some value to the movement. I think this is another reason why people look at this and think, why does this seem to be all consuming in a way that used to be a little bit more isolated to, enclaves on college campuses and maybe aspects of Hollywood where you expected to see it. Now you've given a voice, or you've given a platform to a lot of other people that were never going to get off the couch and go out there and march, but they're happy to sit in the comfort of their own home and just troll 24/7. Right? You've now activated a whole group of people that used to not, they were idiots, they just weren't useful.
And now they're useful.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Now they're useful.
I wasn't thinking about that because when I said earlier, I was like, somebody that's actually out there throwing the tomato soup at the Mona Lisa is more useful to the left's project than somebody sitting at home on Reddit or Twitter. That's actually, I might actually take that back because that, based on the point that you just brought up, that's actually debatable. Mm-hmm. At least nowadays.
Because they're part of the activation.
10 years ago, that might have been different. But
they're part of spinning everybody up into the frenzy to activate them.
Well, the important part to understand is that there's again, it used to be that the role of the person blocking the traffic or protesting or doing that was the predominant role. And in some ways it still is. You need to have that in order to give the people over here that used to have no real role the ability to share, like, comment, send out. And what it does is it gives the impression that the person, because anybody that sits there and says, well, this is just two idiots, throwing tomato soup at a painting. Okay, but when 20,000 people sitting at home then share that to their group of followers that may range from a couple dozen to a few 100,000, all of a sudden this is amplified significantly across the board, and it gives the impression of being far more prominent than it might be. And because of that, it actually becomes more influential than it otherwise would have been. So they've actually found a way to activate both the people that are active and out there and doing things and the people that can actually share it through a larger platform.
Yeah.
So that ability to activate and to activate them in an area for which they are comfortable to be activated is actually pretty important. I would say the other thing here that is critical, and this is something that we'll share a little bit later on the episode with Yuri Bezmenov, is they have to be essentially impervious to reason.
This is where the idiot part comes in, because you need to be smart enough to follow orders, so to speak, but dumb enough to not question the fact that you're being used as a pawn.
Okay, I take issue with the idea that it's about being dumb enough to do this. The reason why is because I think that growing up through the entire system and having all of these things reiterated over and over and over again at every single elevation through the system. I mean, from you got preschool now, primary school, you've got junior high, high school, higher education now, all the way up. And so it doesn't have to be that they have you in a class where they just brainwash you the whole time and do this over and over again. What it is they have bits and pieces throughout your entire life that have built the foundation for this type of behavior. So it's not necessarily that they can tell. It's not that they're an idiot. It's not that they are low IQ.
Yeah.
It's the fact that all the information
It's a mind virus
that they have consumed has poisoned the system.
Well, and this goes back to the point you were making earlier. Like if you go on the wiki page for cultural Marxism now, it's going to tell you it's an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. If you went on the same cultural Marxism wiki page 5-10 years ago, it would have talked about this was a theory worked out by Antonio Gramsci and others. Where
Christian showed that on a previous podcast.
He did. But they would go through the process of actually showing you that no, Gramsci and again others said this was necessary. That if you actually wanted to overthrow a free market system, a capitalist system, what is kind of traditionally known as liberal democracy or one, and you wanted to replace it with a Marxist system, you couldn't simply do it by depending on the workers to rise up, because capitalism did a better job of taking care of workers than the socialist systems. And that's what Gramsci recognized in the 1930s in Italy. And so as he articulated what needed to happen, what he said is that you need intellectual capture within culturally shaping institutions. And this became known as cultural Marxism, or the march through the institutions.
It was actually Duchke that took he was the German Marxist, right? He took and what's interesting is a lot of these people were operating independent of the Soviets.
Yes.
That's another thing that's worth pointing out, that because there's a lot of people that think this was all a conspiracy from Moscow.
Yeah.
Moscow did play a role, but a lot of these people were acting independent of Moscow. And so, I think it was Duchke that took Gramsci's original writings, like his prison notebooks, where he was saying this stuff and he was writing kind of in between the lines in a lot of cases, because the fascist guards weren't going to let him smuggle out, here's the master plan on how to overthrow the system, right? But, he took, and this was in the 50s and 60s, especially the 60s. Duchke took Gramsci's writings and he kind of came up with the concept of the long march through the institutions as being the mechanism to fulfill what Gramsci was talking about when it came to creating this counterculture, this counter hegemony to overthrow the capitalist or Western system. And when we talk about useful idiots, I just wanted to clarify something that Tina brought up, because it's an important point that needs clarification. It's not that the useful idiots, to your point, Tina, have a low IQ. Some of them might, right? But it's not that they have a low IQ. It's that they've been ideologically captured and brainwashed. This is why I said earlier it's a mind virus. Elon talks about this too.
Over time. It didn't happen quickly. It's not like they were put in a camp somewhere and it was done quickly.
It's people that are holding the best way to describe it is otherwise rational people holding incredibly irrational ideas, worldviews, viewpoints, approaches to whatever the topic of the day may be.
They're institutionalized.
Well, and I think it's important to understand that one of the ways I talk about it here is impervious to reason. Now, understand what I mean by that. I don't mean impervious to reason as if they never use reason. Of course they use reason. They use reason all the time when they get up in the morning, when they feed themselves breakfast, when they drive their car to work, when they design what the flyer is going to look like that they're going to post up all around the college campus in order to oppose a speaker. They're using reason to apply all of these things. The problem is that when reason no longer serves their purpose, and you see this all the time in these exchanges, right? When reason no longer serves their purpose, they automatically transition to, you're a bigot, you're a racist, you're a this phobe, you're a that phobe, right? And when you say, wait a second, all I'm doing is applying logic or the scientific method or whatnot, it's like, well, these were all set up by white patriarchal systems in order to marginalize communities. Like, you were using logic 5 seconds ago. 5 seconds ago, you were using the scientific method. And then when they respond with, yeah, but you're an oppressor. Now we see what it is. You're not impervious to reason when it's useful for your objectives, but you don't think your objectives should be subject to reason. You don't think your processes should be subject to reason because you're the good guy. This is where you see people.
It makes it much more nefarious.
This is where you see people like AOC saying things like, well, it's more important to be morally correct than it is factually correct. Like, wait a second. I get what you're saying in the sense that you want to be morally correct in your actions, but morally correct actions don't require a break from facts and reason and logic.
This is also why the State of the Union, the State of the Union address a few days ago, when Joe Biden was talking about that poor lady that was murdered by an illegal immigrant.
Yeah.
When he mentioned her name and then said she was killed by an illegal immigrant, you had waves of Democrats taking to Twitter, not to be upset about the fact that he mispronounced the lady's name wrong, but the fact that he used the word illegal immigrant and said, this is offensive. I take huge objection to this. No person is illegal. Yeah. You had a tweet thread, a chain. It was hilarious watching this.
He basically apologized for
You had multiple Democrats, from like Cory Bush to Ilhan Omar to more moderate Democrats, that were all going out there being like, this is problematic that Joe Biden is out here using the phrase illegal. Yeah. No human being is illegal. I remember I actually quoted Ilhan Omar and I was like, no human being's illegal. But plenty of human beings can be described as bigots, hateful, transphobes, racists, fascists, insurrectionists, traitors to democracy. It's kind of hilarious how the left will declare some words are completely out of bounds because they're from their standpoint offensive towards certain people, but then they can throw out language that would be used to justify lining up their opposition against a wall and shooting them.
Well, we were discussing this. We were discussing this in session a while back because they kept referring to undocumented members of our community, because in Virginia they just passed a bill through the House and the Senate that would allow somebody that came over to the country illegally, right? So I didn't say an illegal person, someone who came into the country illegally, as long as they were covered under DACA, they can now be the chief of police in Virginia in a city without being a U.S. citizen. And they wanted him to be able to serve on boards and commissions at the city level. And we kept saying, it's like, you are giving people that are in the country illegally powers to do things that we generally reserve for citizens. They kept referring to them as undocumented members of our community. And we started coming up with, like, what are they going to come up with next? Well, that's an aggressively amorous member of our community. You mean a rapist? Like what other terminology do you want to use? And overthrowing language is a part of the overall strategy.
Yeah.
And so what needs to be understood is, again, what makes them useful? Easy to manipulate, right? You've essentially, in many cases, if you can take away their individual identity and replace it with a group identity, that's critical, because now their entire being is caught up in being a member of this group. Then if you break down all of society into oppressor and oppressed, and they're in the oppressed group, now whatever they do is morally justifiable because they're doing it to oppressors. And then it's the imperviousness to reason, which doesn't mean they're incapable of using reason. What it means is that while they will use reason to challenge you, you can never use reason to challenge them. Now, if you have someone that is willing to do all of those things, plus they can be activated. They can be activated to do something that is useful to the movement. Well, now you have someone that can theoretically be activated to do just about anything, and you don't have to worry about them being convinced of something different through logic or through reason.
I think one of the reasons why you don't have to worry about them being convinced of something is because of the motivators they use in order to activate these people. I believe there are two main motivators that they use, and that one of them is hatred for X, Y, and Z, whatever it might be.
Injustice.
Well, okay. Okay.
That's the claim.
You can say that, but it's usually aimed at a specific group. And so there's hatred, and then there's fear. So they use hatred and fear to activate these people. Fear is like your climate change people. It's all fear-based. And then you've got hatred. Those are the people that call everybody a bigot and a homophobe and all this stuff. Like, it's all hatred motivated because it's all about, these are the oppressors. Let's hate them. And if you can hate that person because they're evil, like, you don't view them necessarily as human. You dehumanize them and you make it okay to hate them. And now anything they say or do, you can just discount it and ignore it.
Absolutely. But the other side of that, so you got a fear component, you got a hatred component, but you've also got a community component, right? They feel a part of this community, and now if they have to do horrible things in service to their community, well, that's fine, because it's not for them as an individual, it's for the community, it's for justice, or it's on behalf of marginalized populations, and it's directed at oppressors. Right? Nobody gets upset about punching a Nazi, right? Nobody gets upset about that. So it's okay as long as everybody who disagrees with you is now a Nazi.
Right. So groupthink is a huge.
It's very important. Like it is necessary. It is necessary. You can't have a bunch of individual actors. They have to be acting as a part of a group on behalf of a group against another group.
And if you defect, you're basically excommunicated, and then those tactics are used on you.
This is, in fact, they're used on you in much higher and more severe degrees than they'll be. So I've never been in one of these groups. So I've just always been a bad guy to them. I'm always an oppressor to them.
Right.
But I'm not a traitor. If you want to watch, like you've experienced this personally, if you want to watch how the left treats people in marginalized communities, the moment they don't come in line with the party line, they get treated far worse than someone like I would.
Ask Brett Weinstein what happens when you've been declared a traitor.
You're
He used to be a college professor and went
at
through.
Evergreen, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the most liberal campuses.
Jordan Peterson as well.
You used to be a socialist.
James Lindsay as well.
There are some groups that I think by default are considered part of the. So some of these groups they would view certain people from certain cultures or genders or whatever as by default being on this side.
Yeah.
And the minute they show they're not on that side, everything changes.
And I want to do this one more part, because now we're going to go into the historical kind of justification for what I wouldn't say historical justification, but historical examples to demonstrate that what we're talking about is not unheard of within society. The other thing that is really important about these groups, right, to make them useful, is there has to be some element of control, which means who gets to activate them, for what purpose, and can you make them stop when you need them to? Because the question is why would a mainstream group want to be associated or affiliated with one of these groups? They don't necessarily want a direct affiliation. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But the whole purpose of it is, if you can use a group which you can activate, and they can cause either a massive amount of damage or an intimidation, but then you can also call them off, or you can redirect their anger at a new cause on a whim. What it demonstrates to everybody else, what it demonstrates to corporate America is, you better do what we say, not because of what we'll do to you, but because of what these people will do to you, what these groups will do to you. They're upset, they're activated, and we're going to try to calm them down on your behalf, but you're going to have to do X, Y, or Z. You're going to have to get on board. You're going to have to raise the flag. You're going to have to do what you're told, or else there will be consequences, because who knows what they'll do. So the last part of that value, which makes them truly valuable, is an element of control, not complete control. You want there to be, there's a little bit of chaos that's in there. But if you can't get them to stop, you have to at least be able to redirect. And one of the things that you've seen with a lot of these organizations, it's amazing how they will spring up overnight, out of the blue, cause massive amounts of damage for a certain amount of time, and then stop. And then it goes away. What happened?
Yeah,
What
and
happened?
You even see certain videos. I remember a few years ago they were pointing out, look at, these are the same activists at this thing, and they're the same activists at that thing. And some of them, I think, are actually employed to do so.
And they absolutely are. Then one of the values too is that what ends up happening, reasonable people look at this and they be horrified by it. They may not like it, but they got a job to go to next morning. They just want it to stop. And so if the way you make it stop is you concede to these points, then the reasonable person that just wants to get on with their life may be willing to accept a whole number of things that they don't think really impacts them. Their house isn't getting burned down. Their store isn't getting burnt down. They still got a job to go to, right? This is a crazy problem over in Portland. But gosh, if we can just make them stop, look, just give them what they want. What's the big deal? Hey, maybe they got a point over here. And the next thing you know, the Overton window has been shifted. Right? Because the issue is never the issue. The issue is the revolution. This is something James Lindsay always points out, and I think he's 100% correct. So let's look about where this has been done before. And the first one we're going to go with.
This is really important because I think, but before you spoil it, I just wanted to bring up this
Before
is
I spoil it.
Reveal it.
because we've got some that I don't think our audience knows about.
Yeah.
That kind of actually span the traditional interpretation of the political spectrum,
Yes.
the left and the right.
Yes.
And the reason I'm interrupting Nick here before he actually reveals the names is because a lot of people have this idea that this is new. It's not. I guarantee you this has been going on. This has been going on for a very long time. When I say this has been going on for a very long time, I don't mean this in a conspiratorial sense. I mean the strategy at play here has been replicated before. And when we talk about useful idiots and how they serve a purpose, when you look at most major revolutions or seizures of power in history, there are usually collections of individuals or groups that play a very important role in doing this up to a point. And what we're seeing today with groups like Antifa or BLM or, Just Stop Oil or any of the climate change protesters or anybody associated with like the transgender movement for that matter, like a lot of these groups and organizations, some of which are very heavily organized or, centralized, some of which are very decentralized, maybe they just have a name attached to them. They're not actually, like a certified, registered interest group or PAC or something like that. It doesn't matter. All of these groups are fulfilling the exact same type of role as the ones that Nick is about to explain right now in these historical examples.
Yeah. So let's look at the first one. And again, if you haven't gone over to like New Discourses and listened to some of the stuff James Lindsay has done, look, I don't agree with James Lindsay on everything, right? We have some disagreements, but I think he has done an excellent job, perhaps the best job of any contemporary right now, and kind of drawing the roots back of what's going on with critical theory, what's going on with wokeism, the Marxification of education, things like that, and drawing it back and showing the historical links, right? Because a lot of people look at this like, this seems conspiratorial. It's like, it's not a conspiracy when all the people who were advocating for it wrote books on how they were going to do it, and then they did it, right? Like this idea that we're sitting around like, oh, this is what their real intention was. How do you know? Well, because they put it in a book. Here it is, right? And this is what they said.
And gave speeches repeatedly.
And gave speeches and became department heads at universities. It's like, this isn't, because again, it is so easy to look back and be like, oh, this was all the Soviets. No, this is an ideology that a lot of people find convincing, and they want to advance their ideology. And insofar as they want to do that, that's not different from anybody else that wants to do it. The difference is how they want to do it and what the ideology is. So stop looking at this as conspiratorial. They were very open and honest about what they wanted to do.
In fact, it's so non-conspiratorial that the links that we have here for a couple of these are from Wikipedia.
Yeah, left-wing sources.
I'm bringing this up because every now and then we have somebody that gets upset with us, like in the comments or something like that, and they're like, really, you're using Wikipedia? Brother, I have like over 20,000 edits on Wikipedia. I used to be obsessed with editing mostly historical articles, mostly about military history, and I noticed that there's an extreme left-wing bias on anything political related on Wikipedia, right? And the reason that we're using these is not because we think that this is the superior source out there. I know full well the problems with Wikipedia. The reason we're using Wikipedia links is because we want to show people this is not a conspiracy. This is open fact that even a center-left outlet, such as Wikipedia, will tell you about.
Yeah. Well, and the two things, so I want to look at, when we use Wikipedia articles, we don't just throw up Wikipedia and say whatever Wikipedia says, we're fine with it. We'll actually go and look at the source material and what they're referencing it from in order to determine whether or not it's a valid source. And if it is, great, then we'll use it. So I want to go first with the Red Guards. So the Red Guards were a mass student-led paramilitary social movement mobilized by Chairman Mao in 1966 until their abolishment in 1968, during the first phase of the Cultural Revolution, which he had instituted. According to a Red Guard leader, the movement's aims were as follows. Chairman Mao has defined our future as an armed revolutionary youth organization. So if Chairman Mao is our Red Commander-in-Chief, we are his Red Guards. Who can stop us? First, we will make China Maoist from inside and out, and then we will help the working people of other countries make the world red, and then the whole universe. And then what it goes on to say is the movement in Beijing culminated during the Red August of 1966, which later spread to other areas in mainland China. Mao made use of this group as propaganda and to accomplish goals such as seizing power and destroying symbols of China's pre-communist past. And this is referred to as the Four Olds. So the Four Olds were old ideas, old culture, old customs, and old habits, including the destruction of ancient artifacts and grave sites of notable Chinese figures. So keep in mind what he's doing here. He's tearing down anything that came before is basically just a mistake and standing in the way of the Cultural Revolution.
I'm sure most people feel like this is sounding really familiar.
Moreover, the government was very permissive of the Red Guards, because keep in mind, the Red Guards, that sounds like this was some unit within the Red Army or unit within the Chinese government. No, it was not. It was a student movement. Moreover, the government was very permissive of the Red Guards and even allowed the Red Guards to inflict bodily harm on people viewed as dissidents. The movement quickly grew out of control, frequently coming into conflict with authority and threatening public security until the government made efforts to rein the youths in. With even Mao himself finding the leftist students to have become too radical, the Red Guards groups also suffered from infighting as factions developed among them. By the end of 1968, the group as a formal movement had dissolved. And that's a very, very polite way to say that Mao violently suppressed them when he didn't find them as useful anymore. So here's the question. Why were the Red Guards formed in 1966? Well, if you look at the Great Leap Forward, which was when Mao came in and said, we're going to industrialize China, we're going to collectivize the crops. This is going to be the great Marxist-Leninist revolution that is going to reshape China. 40 million people, that's the conservative estimate, died. Not just through the government coming in and murdering people, but basically being starved to death through widespread government-imposed famine because of complete mismanagement of agriculture, the industrial sector. We actually did a whole Y-Minutes on how the government even tried to kill sparrows because sparrows were eating the grain. You know what sparrows were also eating? Locusts. They actually had a government-imposed famine in part because of the government's instructions to go out and have a widespread movement to kill sparrows, right? So he did all this. Tens of millions of Chinese people starved to death. And you had some leadership conflicts within the Communist Party in China. And so all of a sudden Mao was no longer the great leader. He had some people starting to challenge him. So what did he do? He mobilized youth paramilitary organizations. He used them to essentially purge anybody within the educational system or of any social prominence that would potentially stand up as a challenge to his rule. He used them to purge elements within the Communist Party, right? And then when they became a little bit difficult to control, he got rid of them, right? Again, they were dissolved. Okay. That might be figurative. It might also be literal.
Well, let's go back to the fact that it's a Wikipedia page, which is why they did not highlight how they did it.
Yeah.
Well, it's worth noting that the students themselves, I mean, it's so incredible. The students themselves ended up becoming more radicalized on the left than even Mao was.
Yeah.
Like think about that. Mao Zedong thought that the Red Guards ended up being too far to the left. Yeah. That's actually an important point because there's another example, and I'm not going to go into detail because when Nick was building the outline, he actually left this one out, but it's one that I just remembered right now. There's an example in the French Revolution, so this tells you just how far back this strategy goes.
Yeah.
There's an example in the French Revolution. So when people think of the French Revolution, they usually think of the two main factions within the revolution after it kickstarted, right? You have the Jacobins on one side and you have the Girondins on the other side. The Girondins they're both Republicans to varying degrees, especially after Louis ends up being deposed.
I think you have to explain Republican, not in the American sense, right?
Republicans in the sense that they supported a republic.
Yeah.
But the Girondins were more conservative than the Jacobins. The Jacobins were the more extreme left-wing faction. The Girondins were kind of the moderates. And they were the previous ruling government until the Jacobins basically staged an insurrection and overthrew them, threw them in prison, had a bunch of mock trials and then chopped their heads off, right? But people leave out that there's more factions than just those two. One faction in particular were called the Herbertists, and it was named after a guy that basically helped found them. And the Herbertists were extreme left-wing. They were proto-Marxists. Remember, this is long before Marx, right? But when you look at the stuff that they were calling for nationalization of industries. They were calling for the government to seize by force things like grain and wine and redistribute it to the people, again, by force. They wanted to nationalize the entire food production. They were more radical than the Jacobins in every single way. And the Herbertists played a very important role because they were very violent as well. They played a very important role in purging the Girondins. The Herbertists were the ones that would go out there into things like the Loire Valley. They went to, I think the city was Lyon. They were the ones that went to these like strongholds of like federalism or Girondin strongholds that, again, in principle agreed with them in the whole down with the monarchy thing, but they weren't radical enough, and they just purged them and executed them in mass.
Yeah.
And then what happened is that they were so radical. They were also extreme atheists. They wanted to not just separate church and state. They wanted to like dissolve all the churches and basically execute all the priests and impose state atheism. They were so radical that Robespierre thought that they needed to be removed. And so once that they had served their purpose of purging all of Robespierre's enemies to the right of him, the Herbertists themselves were purged and guillotined in 1794. In March 1794, just a few months before Robespierre himself was overthrown and executed. So I bring this up because this is another example of, at the time, it wasn't a conspiracy. I don't think that Robespierre was thinking, I'm going to use these people to get rid of my enemies. It probably halfway through the project, he realized, oh, these people are doing my dirty work for me. And then he came to the conclusion, these people are nuts. We need to get rid of them. And so then he ended up purging to his own left, despite the fact that he is, to this day, remembered as kind of the notorious left-wing leader of the revolution that oversaw the bloodiest moments of it during the Reign of Terror. So I bring up this story because the Red Guards, in many respects, represent the same thing. And it's the same exact story, different revolution, different revolutionary leader, different movement, but same exact story playing out.
Yeah, because there's a strategy to it. There's a reasoning behind it, right? And again, if you want to know more about the Red Guards, it's, again, you can look at the origins here. It started off as a university. There was a play that was done. There was political, pamphlets that were made and whatnot. And if you look at it, so it started at I apologize for my pronunciation, Tsinghua University Middle School, who were given the name. So the first students that called themselves Red Guards in China were from the Tsinghua University Middle School, who were given the name to sign two big character posters issued on 25 May and 2 June 1966. The students believed that the criticism of the play Hai Rui dismissed from office was a political issue and needed greater attention. The group of students, led by Zhang Chengzai, at the school, and Nai Yuanzi at Peking University, originally wrote the posters as a constructive criticism of Tsinghua University and Peking University's administrators, who were accused of harboring intellectual elitism and bourgeois tendencies. Most of the early Red Guards came from the so-called 5 categories. So what are the 5 red categories? So the 5 red categories, you have the 5 red categories and the 5 black categories. The 5 red categories were poor and lower middle class peasants, workers, revolutionary soldiers, revolutionary cadre, who are active members of the CCP in good standing, so active members of the Communist Party, revolutionary martyrs, including immediate family members, children, grandchildren, and relatives of deceased CCP members and PLA service personnel killed in action. So those were the 5 red categories, right? So a lot of the people came from that made up the Red Guards came from that. So who were the 5 black categories that they were opposed to? Landlords, rich farmers, counter-revolutionaries, bad influencers, and right-wingers, right? So there's your oppressed, right? Or there's your oppressors, They were the oppressed. So there's a reason why when Lindsay talks so much about the certain movements taking place in the United States right now, he draws it back to Maoist China. But Maoist China is not the only area that this obviously happened. Christian just brought up examples for where it happened over in during the French Revolution. Let's bring up another organization called the SA. So the SA was also kind of, I think, colloquial known as the brown shirts. And as Nazism was becoming more prevalent in Germany, right? But this is, again, largely before Hitler took dictatorial power over Germany, he had the brown shirts. And so I'm not even, it's this Sturmbettelung. I can't.
It means storm division.
It means
or storm battalion.
Storm division or stormtroopers.
I love how you tried to put that German accent in there with it.
It's the storm belong. I don't know.
See, you could say it once you do that.
The story. So basically, the stormtrooper, it was the original paramilitary wing of the Nazi Party. It played a significant role in Adolf Hitler's rise to power in the 1920s and 1930s. Its primary purposes was providing protection for Nazi rallies and assemblies, disrupting the meetings of opposing parties, fighting against the paramilitary units of opposing parties, because you had a lot of these groups that had them. The SA were colloquially called brown shirts because of the color of their uniform shirts, similar to Benito Mussolini's black shirts. The official uniform of the SA was a brown shirt with a brown tie. Won't go into the rest of that. But here's what's interesting is that, again, this was another group that was paramilitary. It wasn't a part of the government. It was kind of like the wing of a political party.
It was before the Nazis even took power.
Yes.
It's part of the reason they did take power.
Yes. And they were used to go out there and intimidate people, to provide protection for their own political leaders and things of that nature. And to, again, hurt, conduct acts of violence, riot, intimidate. And interestingly enough, when the Nazis did get into power, they started to significantly reduce the influence and power of these paramilitary organizations. That's when you see the duties of the SA largely being replaced by the SS.
That's a reason there's a reason that when most people learn about World War II history, they learn about the SS.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of people that when they learn about the Nazis, they've never even heard of the SA. I'm willing to bet there's a good chunk of people out there that they've heard of the SS. Obviously, they've heard of Hitler, right? They've heard of Nazi Germany, but they've never even heard of the SA.
No.
And the reason why is because the SA technically lasted until the end of Nazi Germany, but de facto, the SA were purged and eliminated in the Night of the Long Knives.
Well, so after the Night of the Long Knives, the SA continued to operate under the leadership of Lutz, but the group was significantly downsized. Within a year's time, the SA membership was reduced by more than 40%. However, the Nazis increased attacks against Jews in the early 1930s and used the SA to carry these out, right? So they were still serving this purpose for the Nazi Party, but they significantly diminished their overall role and power once the Nazis actually had an official apparatus. What's also interesting about this, because there's so many discussions about how that fascism is the antithesis to communism, and obviously there are significant differences between the two ideologies. But in the 1936 Hitler, a biography, German historian Konrad Heiden remarked that within the SA ranks there were large numbers of former communists and social democrats, and that many of the stormtroops were called beefsteaks, brown on the outside, red within. And this is an argument that we've made before. When you look at a lot of these authoritarian or dictatorial regimes, especially within the 20th century, you will find that what they call right wing, obviously, doesn't make sense to Americans, because right wing in our political tradition is significantly different. We'll probably do a whole episode on this sometimes, on why right wing in the European tradition does not perfectly translate to right wing within the American tradition. But essentially, a lot of these fascist organizations and these Nazi organizations that were being utilized, right, that were separate from the government, but being utilized to carry out dirty work and things of that nature, were actually staffed by a lot of people that consider themselves socialists, national socialists, or even communists. But again, you see similar tactics being used, where when the purpose of the organization pushing the ideology is trying to rise to power, they love these little paramilitary organizations, but when they get into power, they will brutally repress them if necessary, because they can become counterproductive to their overall objectives. And we're going to talk a little bit on why is that later. Some of the other interesting places where you see things like this happening, North Korea is an obvious example. Fascist Italy is an example. The last thing we want to do here real quick as we talk about some of the historical relevance of this is we also want to point out this clip from Yuri Bezmenov. So Yuri Bezmenov used to work on kind of the propaganda wing with the KGB. It's not like he was a KGB agent. He actually worked as part of a press corps where he would receive foreign dignitaries, foreign academics, foreign news media personnel, and his responsibility was kind of to take them around to make sure that when they were writing their articles and when they were reporting back, that one, they were treated incredibly well as they were, touring Soviet Russia, and that the objective was to get good reports out of foreign media for the Soviet Union. And so they worked hand in hand with the KGB in order to achieve that objective. Well, Yuri Bezmenov defected, came to the United States, and I'm gonna list off. So this is the full interview is about an hour and 20 minutes long. You can, if you just type in Yuri Bezmenov interview, there's several that will come up. But I want to play a quick clip. It's only about 40 seconds from this interview where he's explaining this whole concept of the people that Soviet propagandists or whatnot or Marxist-Leninists would attempt to manipulate, organize, and then activate. And the question that the interviewer says is, okay, but after you seize power, what happens to these people? And Yuri Bezmenov explains it in this roughly 40-second clip. So I'm going to play that right now.
Favor and in the interests of the United States society.
And yet these people who've been programmed and, as you say, in place and
Yes.
who are favorable to an opening with the Soviet concept, these are the very people who would be marked for extermination in this country?
Most of them, yes. Simply because the psychological shock when they will see in future what the beautiful society of equality and social justice means in practice, obviously they will revolt. They will be very unhappy, frustrated people, and the Marxist-Leninist regime does not tolerate these people.
So you see what he's saying there, right? He's saying that you're going to have, there's actually two components here. He talks about another aspect of this later. We're going to address both here in just a moment. But what he says is that the same people that have been kind of radicalized in this idea of dissidence and they've been fed this picture of utopia, when they don't get utopia, all of a sudden they become problematic to the regime.
I love how he uses the phrase, they're going to, when they see what equality and social justice looks like. This is a 40-year-old interview.
This is 1984.
And he's using the phrase social justice, which I find very interesting. You know what that tells me? That tells me that wokeism is simply a recent term to describe an old phenomenon.
Yes. And again, if you want to learn more about Yuri Bezmenov, we've actually done an entire episode talking about the idea of what was it? Active measures?
Active measures and ideological subversion.
Yeah, active measures was an objective of the Soviet Union, where essentially they would try to influence countries to adopt Marxist-Leninism, and they had a process for doing so, and there was 4 stages to it. He goes through it. We're not going to get into it here, but when he was talking about this ideological subversion and these groups that were utilized, again, the idea is once the revolution has been realized, once the people that wanted power have seized power, they don't see a lot of use for a bunch of radicalized activists that are going around potentially whose only real skill set is disruption, right? Disruption might be fine when you're trying to overturn the current regime. When you're the one trying to make the trains run on time, the hospitals work, the economy run, all of a sudden disruption is problematic.
You do not want to disrupt an attempt to consolidate power.
Yeah.
You disrupt the status quo in order to obtain power. You do not disrupt the status quo once you're trying to become the status quo, right? Which is why I think that we brought up the example of the SA, because what makes the SA separate, other than the fact that they were part of the Nazi party, right? What makes the SA separate from Mao's Red Guards is that Mao's Red Guards were used in order to solidify the regime, right? Because Mao had already won the Civil War by that point. He had been ruling for, over a decade, well over a decade, almost 2 decades by the time that the Red Guards became a thing. But he was trying to still remake China in his image, right? What I think, and this is going to be a controversial take, but I think you're going to know where I'm going with this. Somebody's going to think of this out of context and be like, "Oh, you're saying these people are Nazis?" No. When we're talking about modern day woke movements, or as Bezmenov talks about 40 years ago, the social justice movement, right? They're actually more similar to the SA. So you see where the controversy comes
Yeah,
in, right?
yeah.
Oh, Christians saying they're the SA. No, hear me out. They're more similar to the SA insofar as the SA played a crucial role in helping the Nazis seize power. But once the Nazis seized power, they had served their purpose. There was no more need to crack heads and do street fighting because the Nazis were already in charge. The other parties were already banned. There were no protests. They were in the process of consolidating power at that point, not obtaining power. And you do not want troublemakers when you're trying to consolidate power that you've already obtained. So this organization served its purpose, and it was eventually purged in what's known as the Night of the Long Knives. And Ernst Röhm, who was the head of the SA, was actually a very close friend of Hitler's.
Yeah.
They had been comrades going all the way back to, I believe, the beer hall putsch. It didn't matter. He was still executed. He was still arrested and then shot by a couple other of Hitler's cronies. And his organization was de facto dissolved. It wasn't legally, but it had lost all of its power. And it was replaced with a new organization whose purpose was not to continue the revolution. The purpose of the SS was to be Hitler's bodyguards. They were supposed to be the Praetorian Guard of Nazi Germany.
Yeah.
And they all swore an oath of loyalty to Hitler. So they served an entirely different role than what the SA was doing, which was supposed to be street fighting and causing trouble and disrupting and creating chaos in society. Well, by the time the Nazis had taken over, they didn't want chaos. They wanted order.
Well, and you also see this in all of these movements, whether it be fascist, whether it be Marxist-Leninist or whatnot. They always move toward authoritarianism, totalitarianism, dictatorial power. And the reason why is because when people act as individual agents, it turns out they don't want to be micromanaged by a government entity. It also turns out that government entities trying to micromanage the decisions of millions of people within their jurisdiction do a really crappy job of providing the basic services they've been promising everyone. And so the end result is that there's revolts, there's black markets, there's sometimes, armed revolution. And so they foster this cult of personality around whatever individual. Now they can't do that initially, right? They can do that to some degree, but usually it's this idea. It's always about the people, marginalized groups, the people that the current society has left behind, right? But always one person ends up being the person that represents those groups. Benito Mussolini, Lenin, then it was Stalin, Chairman Mao, Castro, right? Hitler, right? There always ends up being somebody that ends up taking on the personification of the revolution, of the people, of whatever it is. And now absolute loyalty is allowed to them because they and the people are now synonymous in their overall propaganda efforts. Right. So there's a reason why it always goes down this direction is because if your ideology demands this sort of compliance, then ultimately you're going to have to use a lot of force and violence in order to achieve it. And when you have organizations like this that you're utilizing up front in order to intimidate or potentially use violence or influence, all right, those people become a liability to the regime when now they have to still serve some of those purposes, but it has to be far more controlled in the way it's executed. You can't just have random student groups or random paramilitary groups kind of doing what they want and operating as their own individual organizations. They have to be directly tied and connected to the personality or to the regime. And so this is what we want to talk about next, right? This is kind of the final portion that we're going to discuss, and that's this whole idea of, okay, so if a lot of these organizations that, and let me clarify something. I should have probably done this earlier. Let me clarify. I am not suggesting that everybody that identifies left of center wants this, right? Or every group or every individual that identifies left of center thinks Antifa is a wonderful organization, or that riots going on or shouting down. Not everyone does. There's people on the left that have a far more moderate view of society, and they just want more welfare programs, right? And then there's other people on the left that are totally radicalized and buy into kind of the Marxist explanation of the world, even if they don't call themselves Marxists. They still buy into that vision of the world. And it might have been so it might, to Tina's point earlier about this whole idea of marching through the institutions and cultural Marxism, they might not even associate it with Karl Marx or communism. They just associate it with taking care of people. They just associate it with helping oppressed minorities or marginalized groups. That's all they associate it with. But in their mind, you tie it back to the ideological foundations of it, and you end up with critical theory, and you end up with Herbert Marcuse, and you end up with Gramsci, and you end up with Marx.
But even in that situation, you still have your more like mainstream leftists who aren't necessarily your crazies, right? That we're talking
They don't
about.
want to seize the means of production.
Right. However, what you do notice is that they are beholden to these groups still. And the reason why I say that is because they toe the line on the language. They toe the line on everything. They know what they are and are not allowed to say. And so even though they may think it's wrong internally, some aspect is wrong, they will never say it out loud usually, and they will not go against their own party. And then if they do, they are very quickly ostracized.
Oh, Joe Biden was elected in part because they thought he was a moderate return to kind of the status quo. As soon as he got in there, he pretty much lockstep in line with what the more radical elements within his party wanted, to the extent that he could achieve it. Right. And then so he's been fairly obedient to the left. And then the moment he makes one statement in the middle of a State of the Union about killed by an illegal, it's immediate. Like, we don't care about anything else. We don't care about anything else said.
Use the wrong
You
language.
use the wrong language. You're not allowed to use that language. How many times do we have to tell you? You don't get to use that language.
Yeah.
And I guaranteed Biden apologize. He'll never use it again. He'll be very, very careful because, to your point, he may be the president of the United States. He ain't the one running the show.
Well, and we even see it at the state level. Like, you just got back from the legislature.
Yeah.
And does anybody on the Democrat side of the aisle ever not toe the line?
No.
You look up there and they all are lockstep in line. They will all vote the same exact way. They will not get up and deviate at all from the messaging, not at all. And so anything and everything that the left is pushing, they will either like quietly try to keep it from ever coming all the way to a vote, so that then they don't have to confront it, or they will just go ahead and go along with it because they know where their bread is buttered.
Is this how you get a situation where you have Democratic politicians who, I guarantee you, 20 years ago had never even heard of the word transgender,
Right.
Yeah.
now lecturing us about how we need to protect trans kids?
Like, this is settled science.
Yeah. No, and
I guarantee you, Joe Biden, 40 years ago, certainly, when he was a U.S. Senator back in the 1980s, he'd probably never even heard of the term.
Well, and it was certainly never. Again, you can
And
go
now
back.
he's tweeting about it, or his staff is.
You can go back to the way back in 2019 when Dennis Prager was on Bill Maher's show, and Dennis Prager said, "It's like, you guys are talking about men that can menstruate," and every single leftist on that panel laughed at Dennis Prager. Why would you say something so stupid? Nobody's saying that. Nobody believes that.
And here we are 5 years later.
Well, and it wasn't even that long. 3 years after that, it was absolute, complete Democrat orthodoxy.
Right.
That you had better repeat this over and over again, and you better mean it. So let's go into what happens. All right. So what happens? Yuri Bezmenov says, if you get, and again, keep in mind here, Yuri Bezmenov is not saying that, well, these in his term, these useful idiots, or these people that have engaged, basically have been complete ideological capture. He's not saying that when the other side takes charge, they're going to be punished. He's saying, no. When the people they've propped up take charge, when the Marxist-Leninists take charge, they'll be purged. They'll either have to get in line very, very quickly, or they'll be purged. So the point that we wanted to go through here today was not just talking about like, okay, well, what if somehow we have a complete turnaround in American politics and now the right's in charge. We want to start off with, okay, what happens when the woke get exactly what they think they want?
Is this the part where we start explaining how no matter what happens,
all
roads lead to Rome?
Yeah,
right? It's it doesn't matter who wins in the end. Your blue-haired, barista studying queer theory at Berkeley is going to end up losing out no matter who ends up on top.
They lose. Like, the first category we want to talk about here was like, okay, what if supposedly the woke win? Which is to say that we're not talking about like Joe Biden gets reelected. We're talking about the woke get exactly what they think they're looking for, right? Like AOC and the squad are running the show and everything else. And the problem is that to some degree, it's almost impossible for some of those people to truly seize power within the current version of woke because they don't have the ability. Like it was one thing. It was one thing for like a Lenin or a Stalin to have certain timing and to have certain principles and to have a certain, atmosphere where they could come in and offer strong leadership or whatever it was and seize power. It's something else for an ideology which is rooted in this notion that reality doesn't exist the way it actually exists if I don't feel like it should that day. It is a lot harder for that person to actually take charge of a society of 330 million people, right? When Mao was coming in saying, we're going to start the Cultural Revolution, he wasn't saying, and oh, by the way, gender differences don't exist anymore.
Can I highlight another difference that we have now versus back then?
Yeah.
You don't see people getting like mass executed in the streets. You don't see people getting mowed down. Mm-hmm. Okay. So in the past, the violence aspect was very real, very consistent. And that was kind of how things were done. So that is how you purged. Mm-hmm. That is how you got rid of your opposition, is you killed them off. and so we don't have that now. Now what we have is the way to get rid of your opposition is to send them through the institutions in order to co-opt them. And then if they don't agree, then,
it's actually worse than that, because it's no longer that you go to the gulag. It's the gulag comes to you. You get deplatformed. If you're Nigel Farage, you get removed from the banking system.
You're basically equating getting deplatformed with getting executed.
No, but having
That's
your
not quite
bank, ask Canadian truckers 2 years ago how they were going to afford groceries when Justin Trudeau decided to cut off their access to their bank accounts.
I agree with you there, but what I'm trying to say is that the movement has no teeth anymore. It doesn't have the teeth of like mass violence that it used to have.
Oh, I disagree.
Well, wait a second. I think
I think the reason why people think it could never go back to how it was under Hitler and it could never go back to how it was under Mussolini or these others is because they think the violence can't happen again because we're so enlightened that we will never resort to that type of violence ever again. You're not going to see mass genocide ever again.
I think that is absolutely true of your college-educated suburban leftist. Your college-educated suburban leftist thinks that, well, of course it's not going to do that because we're the good people. We would never resort to things like that. Right, and I absolutely believe that this idea that the era of mass shootings or like lining people up and executing your political opponents, the idea that that's been purged from the human psyche requires a degree of ignorance of human history that is offensive. Right? No, we have not planned that out of human nature. It's still there. All that is required is conditions and a catalyst. Now, I think, again, to your point, though, I think you're right. When the left and when especially the woke left has advertised themselves as we're the peaceful, tolerant people, coexist and, justice denied anywhere is justice denied everywhere and the whole deal. It seems very easy to think, it seems very easy to look at the person doing drag queen story hour and think, is this person really going to lead, a division of red guards to, pull everybody out of their homes and execute them for, no, nobody thinks that, right? That just seems absurd. And on some level, it is, right? I'm not saying the current people that are engaging in some of these activities are going to then translate into let's line everybody up and shoot them.
No, but they might be the mascot.
That's the point.
Right.
That's the point, right? It is they end up being the reason why somebody else does it, especially once you've convinced them that if they don't do it, if they don't put down their political enemies, they're going to commit acts of genocide against them, right? There's a reason why nobody gets mad when you punch a Nazi.
Yeah, remember the rhetoric that I said earlier that the left gets upset when somebody uses, including one of their own, uses the term illegal alien to describe an illegal alien. But they have no problems calling, Remember the episode we did on rural white rage
Yeah,
and
white rural
Christian
rage.
nationalism? They have no problem throwing around those labels to somebody like Nick because he lives in rural Virginia. He has a rural white rage problem. They have no problem calling us fascists. They have no problem calling us Nazis.
And then the latest,
we're threats to democracy.
That's
right?
the latest, right? You are a threat to democracy. It is one thing to say, I believe you're wrong. It is one thing to say that I believe your policies are incorrect. It's one thing to even say, I think your policies are hurting people. It is something very different to say you are a threat to democracy. Well, what do you do with threats? You remove them. You re-educate them, right?
And if that doesn't work, you put them down.
So
right?
So the idea is that no, I'm sorry, nobody gets to tell me that an intellectual groundwork is not being laid in order to justify aggressive violence, because to them it will seem defensive.
Right.
I didn't want to do this. You forced. All we asked was for you to respect our pronouns, our right to exist. And you said no. And so now there needs to be consequences. And the consequences start off with being deplatformed or having your bank, account frozen. That's how it starts, right? Then it starts with you going to jail, or then it proceeds to you going to jail. And if all of that doesn't work to get you in line, to re-educate you so that now you're as tolerant and accepting as we are, well, then what happens after that? That is not
the penalty for treason, Nick.
That's not an unreasonable question, because we've seen what these leftist movements have done throughout history. We've seen what totalitarian and authoritarian movements have done throughout history, regardless of what their political motivation was.
So why do they lose? If they win, you're starting with the, because we hinted that there's like 4 outcomes, right? The first one is they win. So how could they lose if they win?
I don't think the woke can actually win in the sense that all of a sudden you have a bunch of people that, essentially have no real grasp on reality, right? The world is not going to be run by people suffering from gender dysphoria who lose their crap when you mispronounce their name at Starbucks, right? That person is never going to rule. Right? The person is never going to be in charge. They're just not. They can't be, because society collapses. Right? They're too busy being a professional victim to actually be able to attain that. Now, there's other people that will utilize or associate with those movements.
Wait. If you're getting to the second one, I've got something that I want to read off to you first. So
I'm not going to the second one.
Okay.
Who are capable within that group, who are willing to utilize it, but don't actually believe it to the same intensity, or still understands that the train's got to run on time, right? But ultimately, what we think of as like kind of the picture in our mind of, again, the blue-haired person sitting in their car doing a TikTok about how hard it is to exist because somebody misgendered them. That person doesn't run anything ever. Sorry. That person will spend their entire existence either in that category as someone that can be used and manipulated to achieve somebody else's political purpose, but they're never going to get the reality that they want because it doesn't exist. And because they're completely incapable of actually doing what would be necessary to seize the means of production, right? That's never going to be them.
So basically, in a battle between delusional ideas and reality wins every time. It might take a while, but reality will
it may
always
take a
win.
while, but it will always win. And again, they will never possess the ability to, ultimately what seizing power requires is the ability to actually use physical force. And guess what you need for that in most cases? Men willing to fight. How many young men do you know willing to die for the banner of wokeism?
I think it was Rudyard that once said, ask any, military age male in the United States who are like almost universally condemned, especially if they're white. But even if they're not, like how many military age men, young men, are like, they're like the number one target of the left. How many of those people are willing to go die? And I think he used the phrase like, for gender queer, youth, like, or are you willing to go out there and die for, honor and glory and your family and stuff like that? And the point that he was trying to make, and I think he said this, maybe it was in his right-wing backlash video, but I can't remember where he made it. But the point that he was trying to make is that the type of people that can end up seizing power or cementing power are the exact type of people that the left have been calling oppressors.
Yeah.
And so the math doesn't actually really kind of work out there.
Oh no, the math isn't math. Okay, in a grandiose battle for seizing power between a bunch of blue-haired feminists, blue-haired fourth wave feminists, and 23-year-old males, the 23-year-old males win. Sorry, that's just reality. How do we know? Well, we have this thing called history, going back for, 10,000 years of recorded human history. And it turns out the fourth wave feminists don't win.
So you know what I think would happen with the whole scenario one here, with the whole woke winning, but they don't actually win, they actually lose by winning, is that it's not that they win and then lose. It's that they get their way until they break something.
Yes.
And then they lose because they have broken something.
Yeah.
I have something that I want to read off to you because I think it'll feed into the other three scenarios here and also explain why scenario one is impossible for them to win. Even if they quote unquote win, they still lose. And it's a bit long, so I'm going to probably try to skip around a little bit. But I wrote this a couple months ago, and I didn't really think at the time that, well, we weren't planning for this podcast, but I never really thought that it was applicable to what we were talking about until literally right now. And I remembered, I'm like, oh man, I need to get Nick's take on this because I don't think you've ever actually read this or heard this. Here's what I had to say. I said, progressivism is foundationally about giving privileges to low status people. And then I go on to say how they got there doesn't actually matter because there's plenty of people that become low status because they make terrible decisions in life. And then there's some people that they're handed a terrible, deck of cards from the beginning. But how they got to low status, whether or not it's deserved through their own terrible decisions or, again, because they were handed a terrible deck of
legitimate
cards.
victims of circumstances beyond their control.
How they got there does not matter. All low status groups are eligible to elevation to sacredness under this ideology of progressivism. This is because progressives don't actually believe things on the basis of whether or not they're true. They believe things based on whether or not they would hurt people's feelings. And pointing out the reasons why some people are low status and some are not is one of the easiest ways to hurt people's feelings, right? If you point out that the reason that the homeless drug addict in San Francisco is at the bottom of the rung of the social hierarchy is, I don't know, maybe because they're a drug addict shooting up heroin on the streets. Well, that's quite offensive to progressives. And if you want another example, think about the illegal immigrant comment, right?
Yeah.
They weren't mad about the fact that the illegal immigrant murdered somebody. They were mad about the fact that their own guy used the phrase illegal immigrant.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but that guy, a murderer, yeah, he's pretty low status in my book, right? But it doesn't matter, right? Asking questions about how somebody got to, and again, there's instances where people are victims, genuine victims, right? But asking those questions, the woke left don't want to do it because it's offensive in their eyes. And they don't care about whether or not something's true. They care about whether or not something's offensive. So then I go on to say that as a result, it's inevitable that all low status people are elevated to sacredness because the progressive validation train has no brakes. So it's not about saying we're going to lift up people that are genuine victims, that are genuinely left behind through no fault of their own. They've done some, they're handed a terrible deck or a terrible pair of cards. It's not about that. It's about, no, we're going to elevate the murderers in society, the drug addicts in society, the people that have destroyed themselves and are at the bottom of the social hierarchy because of decisions and actions that they have willingly taken. The validation train has no brakes. It doesn't stop with legitimate grievances. It continues on.
Well, wait, let me stop you right there because I think something needs to be pointed out here.
Okay.
The person born into horrible circumstances or situation completely beyond their control, which rises above that.
Oh, they're even worse than the left side.
They are considered, it contradicts their entire narrative about society. Upward economic mobility, upward social mobility, that is what they are claiming does not exist, and why they need, that is the entire justification for them taking power, is because you will never be able to achieve greater social mobility or economic mobility without their help. And when someone does it without their help, right, that they have to suppress that. That is something that they will, and sometimes viciously, suppress.
Look at how they treat black conservatives or Tina when she ran for office. And I want to bring this up because some of the language that I use sometimes, I see Nick gets like I don't know if I agree with that. Okay, when I use the phrase status, what I mean is we are not aristocrats.
Yeah.
We do not believe that status is something assigned at birth and it's permanent and fixed and you are what you are. What I mean is a true meritocracy, right? Where again, the hardest working, most productive, the best ideas rise to the top. And so when I say things like low status, I don't mean this in an aristocratic sense where it's like a caste system.
No,
right?
you don't mean it in a pejorative. You're saying that obviously there's certain people that are different, again, economic, social, political status within society. Sometimes it's a result of their own actions. Sometimes it's a result of circumstances beyond their control. Oftentimes it's a combination of both things. So I get that.
Yeah.
I get that.
I just wanted to clarify that I'm not advocating for like a caste system here, right?
Yeah, you're not doing this as a class.
But they would also take the people who, made a lot of really horrible decisions, and they would go, but that wasn't your fault.
Yeah, that's my whole point. The leftist validation train has no brakes, including people who they're low status because they're a murderer or a rapist. No, they deserve to be considered shunned by society because they killed somebody or they robbed somebody or they raped somebody. Anyway, I get to this point and I say this obviously leads to a massive degree of hypocrisy in short order. It's how we ended up witnessing progressives taking to the streets arguing that the U.S. government is racist for retaliating against the Houthis. It doesn't matter that the Houthis are an Islamic terrorist group engaging in open piracy in the Red Sea, but because they're also non-white third worlders waging jihad against the Jews in America, which are two of the ultimate oppressors in the left's paradigm. Therefore, no violence against them can be justified. This is also why so many progressives are also Hamas apologists, despite the numerous war crimes and acts of genocide that Hamas is engaged in, particularly against Jews and LGBT people. Again, two other groups that one historically was considered oppressed by the progressive left, and now they're the oppressors, and the other one is another favored group by the progressive left. And then I go on to say, as we've seen with Hamas and the Houthis, the worse off a person or group acts, think about the illegal immigrant one, right? The worse off a person or group acts, the more praise progressives lavish upon them. Progressivism is an ideology that is fundamentally unable to check its own excesses and unable to let go of any sacred cause, which inevitably produces unhinged doublethink as one incompatible cause stacks up over another until the entire house of cards comes crumbling down. Only the entire house of cards has not come crumbling down. So why hasn't it? Why is progressivism or wokeism still standing despite its own laughable internal contradictions? Normally, this would herald the collapse of the ideology, but it's been kept alive, contradictions and all, by a plethora of culturally shaping institutions, that's what we talked about earlier, that have been ideologically captured. And then I go on to explain what those are. And then here's the part that actually gets to why wokeism will lose even if it wins. And it opens us up to talking about the other three outcomes here. Because I conclude with saying this. This is also why culturally it appears that things are constantly getting worse all the time. Because they are. Clown World is a manifestation of the left's hijacking of America's institutions. Antonio Gramsci and Rudy Dutschke won, but the long march through the institutions did not produce a Marxist revolution as Gramsci had hoped. Instead, it has produced an abomination that's arguably even worse, because there's always an even low-status person or group out there to champion. As a result, progressives are in a constant arms race with themselves to see who they can validate the most degenerate, depraved, and dysfunctional elements of society. We thought wokeism and intersectionality were bad before when progressives cheered loudly for the outcasts in society. But now they're cheering on the lunatics. And I assure you, it's going to get much, much worse. This train has no brakes. The Soviet Union is long gone, but the ideological subversion tactics that Yuri Bezmenov warned us about more than 40 years ago are still plowing forward, past the station and even past the buffer stop. The progressive validation train has now flown off the rails, with no KGB conductor on board to purge the useful idiots after they've laid the tracks for the Marxist takeover. But the train will come to a halt eventually. The only question is who will bring a stop to it and put an end to the madness.
No, I think that's a pretty good synopsis of what we're actually looking at. And I think part of the break, to your point about the lunacy, right? This isn't just about bad economic ideas. This is about absolute lunacy and a complete break with reality. And that's the part where it's hard to figure out any way in which the woke win. Because again, they don't have the people willing to die for God and country, right? Lenin had young men that were willing to die if it meant that they were no longer going to be oppressed by the czars, if they were no longer going to be sent off, to be shot by the Wehrmacht, right? Like he got it, right?
No, the German Imperial Army.
German Imperial Army. it's the same thing. Like, Castro had certain legitimate grievances, and he could promise the people that were actually willing to fight and seize the means of production something if they won, right? Like woke can't do that. So all they're good for then is for people on the left that do understand that reality still plays a part in the world, and they can be used in order to help prop up those people. And they will make certain promises to them in exchange for their political support, provided that their political support never gets turned against them. But to your point, how do you do that when there's an endless regression of the next thing that you're going to prop up? Because at least before, when you talked about the earlier stages of critical theory, they could point to institutional and systematic racism. The problem for them is that Americans could be convinced that, yes, Jim Crow is evil. Americans could be convinced that, yes, it is inappropriate to have this sort of inequalities before the law. And then all of a sudden, when you start to correct for those things, now all of a sudden, well, crap, we need something. Sexism. Okay, again, reasonable people could be convinced. But now you're at a point right now where, well, my 13-year-old said that they're a girl, even though they're a biological boy, and now the state is going to punish me if I don't affirm their gender dysphoria. Now we're in total clown world, because now we're no longer even talking about objective reality, because at least in objective reality, you can have a difference of perspective. You can say, well, I see it this way, I see it this way, we can disagree, but ultimately reality will tell us which perspective was closer to the truth. But when you throw out truth altogether, and now you even throw out the basic concepts of understanding how reality functions, and you say that as long as this person feels a certain way, that is to be validated. Yes. That is to be validated at the expense of reality. Now you've opened the world up to an infinite regression where nobody knows where it stops. And maybe that was by design, and maybe it wasn't. But the bottom line is, people committed to that can never be in charge. They can only be used by other people that want to be in charge.
I loved your point about how there's legitimate grievances, but they've gone far beyond that. Because going back to the status thing, wait, real quick, because ultimately they weren't there to actually satisfy or to correct the legitimate grievance. They were there to overthrow the American system
for the one that they wanted, and that was a useful prop until it wasn't.
So like if you think of like slavery or Jim Crow or the first generation of, like the women's suffrage movement, you can say, well, the social hierarchy that we had when slavery was around, African Americans were low status because the institutions were enslaving them.
Yeah.
That's unjust, right? That's an example of somebody being in a low status category, a slave. That's the lowest status you can be, right? And that's unjust. And so you can point to that and say, well, we need to remove this because that's not fair. And a conservative, certainly a libertarian, would say, yes, we want a true meritocracy. If we're going to have a hierarchy, and I mean, hierarchy is inevitable, then it should be based around your talents and your merits and how far you can get in
character.
life. You shouldn't be assigned to the lowest rung of society because you were born a slave. And so the conservative would agree with this, but that doesn't serve the purpose of the woke left. This is why they don't stop after the civil rights movement. Instead, they say, no, we need DEI now.
Well, and it also doesn't. So it's important, and I think you're getting to this. The first thing, it doesn't serve the purpose of the woke left, but it doesn't serve the purpose of the left, period.
Yeah.
If your version of left, now again, you could say that there's a version of the left that is still rooted in classical liberalism. Right. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the version of the left that is largely rooted, whether they recognize it or not, in a Marxist explanation of society and a desire to go where Marx wanted to go with respect to this new ultra egalitarian dictatorship of the proletariat, new communist person like that. If that's what you want, you can utilize this, but again, ultimately, it's not going to be good enough for them either. And that's the group. The one that I'm worried about actually seizing the means of production is not, again, the blue-haired person screaming at Ben Shapiro at a college campus. The person that I'm more worried about is the leftist who understands this is just a tool in order to get to an end.
I'm worried about the 21st century Antonio Gramsci being the one that seizes
the
power.
Antonio Gramsci, the Stalin, the Mao, the whoever it is, right? It's the person that's going to seize power on behalf of the people, on behalf of this person, right? But then that person ends up becoming a rather low status pawn in the Great Revolution.
So this
right?
is the second outcome, which is really
Well,
the first
hold
outcome
on, though.
taken to its logical conclusion.
Okay, can I just plug something in here real quick? One aspect that I think isn't really being considered that much is the movement, all the different factions of the movements, right? All of these different factions of the left. They have something now that they never had before, because it used to be the information flowed from the people who had it to the people they wanted to get it. And now information flows fairly freely, at least in the US. Some platform suppression happens, but the flow of information and the fact that you can get information so fast now, it doesn't take time, means this is the problem on the left, is the cancellation issue, is because one misstep of anybody in leadership and they're canceled, and the mob like drags them down and props somebody new up. So that's why it becomes a little bit difficult for one person to be who they gather behind, because one person's going to run afoul of the cancellation at some point, and they're going to get dragged down and they'll put somebody else up. So it almost will become this weird circular thing that never quite gets there because of all the new rules that they're creating.
No,
But it will get there. That's Nick's point, right?
Well, but to Tina's point, it can never be their person, right? It can never be their person because of the infinite regress, right? There's no such thing. They will never get their perfect leader. All they'll get is somebody that was smart enough to use them in order to achieve and consolidate political power. And once they consolidate it, their cabinet is not going to be them, right? There's going to be a lot of, again, blue-haired wokeist Antifa members who are shocked when they're not writing poetry for the revolution. Instead, they're working in the mines, right?
Or they're dead in a ditch.
Yeah, or they're in a jail somewhere. So that's the thing to get with. So if the woke can't take control, they don't possess the ability to do it. The far left can. The far left can take control, and they can utilize them to do it.
The KGB hop on board, to use the analogy, they hop on board the train that they jumped off when the Soviet Union disintegrated, and they realize, we have the chance to finally purge the useful idiots and put a stop to the train.
Well, and that's really the broader question, though, is that who is that, though? Who is that on the left right now? Is it Gavin Newsom? Is it like who is it that can utilize that to take power and then actually consolidate it and truly run it? And I don't, again, in part as a credit to the American system, I think it's actually very, very difficult to do within our society, because we don't have, regardless of what the left says about us, we don't have a society built around the centralization of power. And so the amount of work that needs to be done, and don't get me wrong, a lot of that work has been done, but to consolidate power around cultural institutions in order to consolidate it around political institutions is very difficult. And then you get into that problem of federal versus state. And so this is the thing where when I look at what happens to the woke when the far left actually but the far left that actually know, that still have some grasp on reality, right? And haven't alienated all the 20-year-old males that they're going to need to actually fight. Where do they go? How do they do it? And I don't think that's very clear right now on who they would utilize to do that, or what sort of additional conditions or catalysts would be necessary in order to achieve it.
We're not there yet. That's the point.
Yeah.
Option 2, where the woke lose, is the left wins, but the woke lose, right? That is the Stalin option.
Yeah.
Or if you're to use other analogies, to go back to the French Revolution, that's the Napoleon analogy.
Yeah.
If you go back to the English Revolution, that's the Cromwell analogy. What I mean, not that Cromwell's a wokist or that Napoleon's a wokist. What I mean, though, is that
they don't have their Mao yet.
The revolutionaries, to also use China, that's the Mao, right?
Yeah.
The revolutionaries defeat, the old conservative forces. That in this case, it'd be us, right?
Yeah.
They defeat us. But then remember, in all these instances, the revolution eventually stops and somebody purges to the left of themselves.
Yeah.
And then solidifies the revolution right then and there. So again, in Russia, it was Stalin. The Russian Revolution comes to an end once Stalin purges Trotsky, who's to the left of him, and he solidifies the revolution with him as dictator. The revolution in France stops once Napoleon takes over, stages the coup, makes himself de facto the emperor, and then a few years later he declares himself the emperor. And once he stages that coup, he actually gave a speech and he said something like, citizens, the revolution is now over.
Yeah.
And in Cromwell's case, I know that's a bit of a loose analogy, but it still applies in the sense that there were revolutionaries that overthrew the monarch, right? In Cromwell's case, they did the same thing. They purged Parliament, and they had the whole rump Parliament, and then Cromwell becomes Lord Protector. He becomes basically the dictator.
Yeah.
And so, there's multiple examples of this. To use the Nazi analogy, right? The SA helps Hitler come into power, but then Hitler purges Rom and the SA itself in the Night of the Long Knives. And at that point, the National Socialist Revolution, it's over.
Yeah.
Hitler solidifies power in his hands, and the SA gets replaced with the SS. So in the instance where the left wins, no, what happens is that the brutal left, realists, right? The pragmatists within the left. And Stalin is a pragmatist.
Yeah.
He's a brutal, evil, murderous dictator, but he is a pragmatist.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact that he signed an alliance with Hitler until Hitler backstabbed him is proof of that,
Yeah.
right? The guy operated on just realpolitik even within his own country.
Yeah.
That is a perfect example of how, you could get a scenario where if the left wins, that doesn't mean that the intersectional woke left wins. That means that maybe they'll still use the rhetoric and slogans of the woke left, but no, they need to make sure that the trains run on time and that the infrastructure works and that the bureaucracy works and that the secret police work. And, and you know what I mean? It's the same example of how
no, it'll be the secret police. It'll be the Ministry of Truth.
Notice how in China, a avowed communist state, right?
Yeah.
The CCP does not actually push wokeism.
Yeah.
You know what they push through TikTok in China? They push, masculine traits and academic excellence and being loyal to the state and the family. And there's actually some things that conservatives say, oh, this is great, but it's still a Marxist, totalitarian regime. But they're pushing things that are actually beneficial to the party, not beneficial to the ideology. Mm-hmm. And so you get a scenario where the CCP, a communist party, is pushing things that, is beneficial to the furtherance of the party and the nation and the state, not to wokeism and intersectionality and oppressive power structures. They don't care about that. They want to make sure that the next generation of communist bureaucrats actually know what on earth they're doing, rather than them studying all the 72 different types of genders that are out there.
Yeah. Well, and so that's the far left taking power, right? The next is what happens if the far right takes power, and this is something where again we've discussed this before, that there is a version of the right that I have no affiliation with, that I have no love for, that I actually think is horrible, and it's the authoritarian right. Right, it's the authoritarian right that basically has come to the conclusion that, the only way we're going to do this is we have to be the ones to seize power, and we're going to talk about strong families, and we're going to talk about strong traditions, and we're going to talk about strong morality, and the way we're going to do it is by arresting people or lining them up and shooting them. Now, I will say this. I don't think you're anywhere, if you look at institutions or organizations or even ideologies on the right and left that have any degree of power or influence, I can point you to all sorts on the left that would have no problem doing pretty horrible things to us that have power and influence. I can't point to any well-organized, run institution or organization on the right in the United States that really wants to carry this out. I mean, the left can talk all day.
No, they're squashed right away.
They're squashed right away. I mean, the closest the left thinks they have is they'll claim Christian nationalism, or they'll claim, MAGA extremism. And the crazy part is that, again, they will attack Trump's rhetoric, but if you actually look at Trump's policies, not only were they not extreme, they weren't even as liberty-minded as I would have liked, right? And so here's what I will say. That version of the far right, I don't believe is, I'm not saying that version doesn't exist. I'm saying that version, I don't believe at this stage in American politics has any genuine political power, influence, economic power, or whatnot. That's not to say it won't in the future, especially if elements of the right can be radicalized on the other side of this equation to believe that if you don't stand up, if you don't seize power, if you don't do all these other things. Now, a lot of people on the left will look at this like, how could you look at January 6th and say that? It's like, well, there were definitely elements of people there on January 6th that believed that and were willing to execute it. But they were a lot smaller than you would have us believe, as more testimony from the January 6th committee that the Democrats deliberately suppressed has come out to demonstrate that no, not everybody that went into the Capitol that day was looking to overthrow the United States government, right? There was a lot of people that seemed to have been welcomed in and took the tour. There's other people that did violent and bad stuff, right? So I'm not excusing that. But that element has no significant political powers, political, social, or economic power within the United States. You can't say the same thing about the far left in the United States.
They control all the institutions.
You can't say the same thing. Well, I wouldn't say every single one. I'm saying that they are heavily influential in most of the culturally shaping institutions where there is no, there's no January 6ers running sociology departments at conservative universities, right? That's not a thing. So let's put this in perspective. Right-wing authoritarianism would be the sort of people that says, look, we want strong families. We want strong morality. We want America. We want to, protect American economy and policies. We want to do all of these things. And the only way we're going to do it is we got to seize power, and we've got to recognize that our enemies are our enemies, both foreign and domestic, and punish them appropriately. I will have nothing to do with a movement that suggests that as a legitimate course of action. I just won't. It's not to say that I want to defend myself or defend my country against people that would try to use similar tactics against me from the left. It's saying that I will not accept a version of the right wing that believes we need to aggressively overthrow our constitutional system in order to save it. I'm not accepting that.
But if that version of the right is the one that wins out,
Then,
I got bad news for the
yeah.
wokeists, right?
Yeah.
For the intersectional types, the blue-haired,
Yeah.
barista studying queer theory. Because guess what? If that version of the right wins, having a degree in queer theory is basically making you're broadcasting that you're an enemy of the state from that standpoint. And I think that the far right scenario, I agree with you that it's not a thing at the moment, but I think it's growing.
I think unfortunately, I think it is growing. I think
The
it would
left
be.
is radicalizing them.
The left is. I'll be honest. When we did the right wing backlash episode almost a year ago, I remember I said something like, "It'll be people like me, a generation younger that have lived and seen their parents and their grandparents and great grandparents push for these things, and they haven't been able to conserve anything. And so
Yeah.
eventually they're going to conclude, well, I'm not even a conservative anymore because there's nothing left to conserve.
Yeah.
And at that point, you just become a full-blown reactionary. And then it's like, well, the answer to the long march through the institutions is burn down the institutions. I actually am in favor of that one. But what I'm trying to say here is that, like,
I am not.
I am not saying the answer is you line up the wokies against the wall.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that at all. But I do agree that I found myself feeling like that I've become radicalized in the sense that you have to play the game. You have to fight fire with fire. I don't think you fight fire by executing your political enemies, because at that point we're just full blown in the zombie apocalypse, right? It's a total breakdown in social order.
No, but you can
Nobody
turn off
wants that.
the government spigot of money
Yes,
to those
that's what I
institutions.
mean.
Well, see-
I mean doing something like that, which is actually somewhat
Well,
more in the liberty mold.
I think
but-
that's different. So again, if let's just be intellectually honest here. The human beings contend with what I believe to be a sinful nature, what other people might just say like realities about human nature and selfishness or greed or whatnot. Human beings contend with that. It is not isolated to the left or to the right. Human beings contend with that. And it can manifest itself in horrible ways and through horrible objectives. And again, there is a far right takeover of this where the woke lose, and the woke lose real bad. Real bad.
That's arguably the worst scenario.
It is probably the worst scenario for them. Now, the fourth scenario that we're going to talk about as we kind of wrap this up is what we refer to as kind of the liberty right. And the reason why we call that is because a lot of terms that used to have pretty shared meaning within American society, whether it be the right or conservatism or Republican or whatever else, all of a sudden now means 7 different things to 7 different people. And so as much as I hate adding another term on top about this, when I talk about the liberty right, what I'm essentially describing are the people that basically think the philosophy within the Declaration of Independence got it right. That generally think that the Constitution, while not perfect, it is arguably the best document that has ever been, created in order to develop a Republican system of government where we put the emphasis on individual liberty, personal responsibility, private property rights, free market economics, freedom of exchange of both commerce and ideas, right? These are the things that we look at as these things have a great deal of value. Now, on top of that, that was also infused with a lot of social things that we generally agree with, strong families, Judeo-Christian values with respect to a framework of objective morality, all of those things. Those are the things that I'm fighting for, right? Those are the things that I want. In that scenario where you have let's say, for lack of a better term, a renaissance of those ideas where society believes them and they become culturally, not just culturally relevant, but they become culturally dominant and therefore politically dominant. In a world like that, woke people are not imprisoned. They're not lined up. They're not sent to re-education camps. But by the same token, they're not given government approval. They're not given government subsidization. They're not given special treatment within the law. It's if you want to live that way, you can. You get to impose it on no one, and the consequences of reality will reveal to you whether or not that was a good idea or not. But we're certainly not going to subsidize the consequences of you choosing something that doesn't reflect reality.
What the wokeists need to realize is this is the best ending for them.
Yes.
Right.
Where they lose ideologically, but they don't get, they actually, believe it or not, they don't get oppressed. I know that they love saying everything's oppression, right? But they don't get oppressed. They don't get backstabbed like the Red Guards and thrown under the bus and purged. And they don't get lined up against the wall because they've been declared enemies of the states and the ones who created the problem in the first place. If a radicalized version of the right takes over and decides to exterminate these people who have destroyed society. Because again, so many of the social problems we have right now have come at the hands of cultural Marxism. So if a version of the right came to power and said, we're going to blame it on these people, guess what? They will be right in blaming it on these people. What wokeists need to realize is you do not want that scenario anymore. You do not want the Mussolini scenario or whatever any more than you want the Stalin scenario, because you're lined up against a wall or you're in a camp or something like that either way, either because you're useful idiot and you no longer serve the purpose, or because you've been declared an enemy of the state who created the crisis that led to the radicalized right taking power in the first place. What you actually want, and you still lose, is the liberty option, which is a restoration of the principles that created this country. And I was saying earlier, I feel like I've become radicalized a little bit. I still hold fast to the idea that the most ideal form of government this side of heaven is the one that the founders created. The thing that makes me pessimistic is that I think John Adams was right when he said that the Constitution is fit for a moral and religious people and none other. And I don't think that the society that we have right now is the type of one that Adams was talking about. And I think a huge reason that the type of society that we have right now is not the one Adams was talking about is actually because of the woke intersectional left, which is kind of the irony in all of this. But Nick, you're absolutely right that that's the ideal outcome for not just us, but also for them. And it's you know what, in some ways it's actually the type of outcome that Malay's trying to push in Argentina. Notice how Malay's not lining people up against the wall.
Yeah.
Malay's not imprisoning people, although he is imprisoning people that are blocking traffic.
Yeah.
And he's cutting off subsidies and welfare to people that are trying to disrupt and break up the system, that are trying to be the useful idiots for the pronists again. He's certainly cracking down on them, but he's not executing them. He's not oppressing them.
No.
He's simply defunding them.
Look, so we've been at this for a while. I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up here right now. Look, the bottom line is this. Again, I'll summarize what I said before. All human beings, I believe, have inherently, you can call it a sinful nature. You can say that we all contend with selfishness, greed, and other characteristics or attributes that we wish we didn't, or that we would like to get under control. And the question is that how does that manifest itself within these groups that are largely utilized for the purpose of disrupting whatever the current status quo is? And it's not to say that the status quo shouldn't be disrupted from time to time. the question is are you going to do it through peaceful mechanisms, and are you going to do it in the sense within an understanding and an appreciation for objective truth, reality, objective morality? Or are you going to do it in this line of infinite regression where any sort of behavior, any sort of attribute or attitude or action, provided it falls within the class of an oppressed person, is now not just accepted, but celebrated and advocated for and lifted up as if it's somehow a model for civil society? If you're going to do that, it's going to break down. You're not going to win. And the reason why you're not going to win is, one, if you're one of the people on the far left woke, I'm sorry, but you don't possess the abilities to actually govern a society. Right? If you're on the far left and you're actually using the woke people to be able to do this, to be able to set up your ideal classless society or your dictatorship of the proletariat, well, you're going to learn real quick that you can't actually run society with people that lose their crap every time they get misgendered ordering coffee at Starbucks. And so the woke aren't useful for them once power has been consolidated. When it comes to the worst elements of what we might call the far right, they end up looking at the woke as the one that got us into this situation in the first place. And yeah, they're not going to treat them well, which is why I don't affiliate with that group of the right. But then the fourth option here, which as Christian has pointed out, and I think is true, which I believe is the best option for a variety of reasons, is the idea that we live in a free and civil society where we recognize that there is such a thing as objective truth and objective morality. There are consequences to one's actions. And what was supposed to make the United States unique, again, was not a centralized government power, but the idea that each individual has inherent worth and that you should be allowed to live your life the way you want, provided you don't infringe on the rights of others to do the same. But if you're going to try to consolidate political power to compel other people to do that, there's going to be a backlash as a result of it. It's unavoidable. The question is what backlash are you going to get? I hope we get to one where we once again recognize people's right to live their lives, to include making mistakes, to include making decisions that I would not agree with, provided that you, A, don't try to impose those decisions on others or force other people to pay for the consequences of your decisions. Because individual liberty requires personal responsibility. The two can't coexist without the other. It's necessary. And I don't want to oppress people. But if the only option you're giving society is to be oppressed or to oppress, well, don't be surprised when that works out in ways you didn't anticipate. Because there's only so many of us fighting for this idea that you should get to live your life from the time you're come into existence to the time you have natural death. You get to live your life completely disagreeing with me, as long as you do it peacefully, and as long as you don't outsource that violence to a government that is then going to compel me to do what you want. Because I'm going to resist that. I'm going to fight against that. You are not going to get me to comply. In main part because I don't require the same of you. And so the question is what sort of society do you ultimately want to live in? Because again, a society that is completely composed of people that are completely detached from reality will govern, will rule, will seize nothing. You can be used for the intentions of others who do possess the capability or the means to be able to seize power, or you can recognize that there's some of us out there that simply want to live in a free society. We don't want to impose our will on you. We will not accept you imposing your will on us. And we can work together when we agree, and we can leave each other alone when we don't. But that's the only option for which all sides of this debate are able to live in some degree of relative peace. So I desperately hope it's the option we choose. Once again, thank you very much for joining us on Making the Argument. Thank you very much to Good Ranchers for sponsoring us. Again, go over to goodranchers.com, use promo code Nick. You get some good deals. Also, they got some really cool swag. Take a look at that as well. But once again, thank you for joining us. It is so good to finally be back in the studio with everyone, and we look forward to pushing out more episodes. Also, consider going over to Circle, which is our community chat. We get a lot of the ideas for the things that we do from going over to our community and asking them, what do they want us to talk about? What sort of issues are they dealing with? How a conversation might hear, or some research that we do might be beneficial to them. So please go over to community and check that out. We got some other interesting episodes that we're going to be talking about here in the future, dealing with some weighty issues with respect to philosophy, education, theology. We're going to be talking about all of that stuff coming up. Once again, thank you very much for joining us, and we will see you next episode.